Hi, I'm Sparrow, and I'm a science communicator with a background in behavioral science and pedagogy. And today's bad science, with a nice short single page of notes, is mud floods. If you don't know anything about mud floods, that's great. That's wonderful. And this is going to be fun for you, especially. If you do, hopefully this will help disabuse you of that notion. So without further ado, here goes. To properly discuss mud floods, we have to talk about Tartaria. And to talk about Tartaria, we have to talk about Tartary. And to talk about Tartary, we have to talk about Guillaume de Lisle, the map maker from France. So he was a student of law, geography, history, and astronomy, and he used all of those various expertises and learnings to create the most accurate maps of his time, including maps of places he had never been, like Canada. In fact, he was highly praised for his map of Canada being the first map of Canada that actually was correct to longitude and latitude, and could be used for navigational purposes rather than just as a general reference of kind of where some of the cities and the various native settlements were. He also made the map that was used for the longest time as the main map and base map of the southeastern United States. Everything from the Great Lakes down to Florida. He mapped that out, and everybody was like, yeah, his map is so good, we're just going to trace it or copy it or use it for our own. Which is why it should come as no surprise that his Mapamund, or map of the world, became the base map used by conspiracy theorists to support the mudfloods. Actually, that should be surprising because it's kind of ridiculous, but he did something with that map that was not unusual for the time, but which mudflooders latched onto, and that is he labeled Northern Asia as Tartary. Now, Tartary was a real place. It was. In fact, it is just as real, historically speaking, as Europe or Africa or the Americas or the West Indies. It was a region that was being called a specific name by the people who made the maps. That's all it was. It wasn't a country, it wasn't a nation, it wasn't a supercontinent, it was just a place. And Tartary became the center of not one, but two conspiracy theories, each in their own time. And I thought that was cool enough that I went ahead and dipped my toes into the first one as well. So congratulations, you get two conspiracy theories. The first one being the product of two clever grifters and post-war sentimentality. See, in the wake of World War II, there were pan-Slavic and Russian nationalist sentiments among the people of Russia and nearby regions. And this makes sense because people have pride in their ethnicity and because Russia contributed massively to the end of the Nazi threat. However, our two grifters, Anatoly Fomenko and Nikolai Lavashov, decided that this was the perfect opportunity to make tons of money writing lies. And so each of them independently wrote books describing an alternate version of history that never happened, in which basically the entirety of Asia and Europe and the entire Eastern world was just one huge Russian nation called Tartaria. And people ate it up. They loved it. It was great. They made tons of money, and people were like, yes, this sounds cool and I like it, therefore I'm going to believe it. And it became so popular, in fact, that the Russian Geographical Society actually debunked it. And I don't know how proactive or lazy the Russian Geographical Society may be, because I'm not Russian. But I know how the gears turn in the American versions of such institutes, and for the government official Geographic Society to say, hey, we're going to put in the effort to prove you wrong, is kind of a big deal. So Tartaria was forgotten for a while, until around 2016, when it suddenly got cool again in the context of mud floods. Now, instead of being the center of this theory, it was sort of a prop used to support it. And I really shouldn't say theory, because it's not. It's more of a... It's not even a hypothesis, because there's nothing to suggest it. It's just an idea that people had and decided was cool enough that they'd just make up a bunch of baloney to support it. But to support this idea, they said, well, if mud floods were real, and if there were people who lived all over the place and got disappeared by these mud floods, then they would probably be called Tartaria, because that was a cool thing once. And if it sounds silly, it's because it is. But they then went out and tried to look for proof of things that would make it seem likely that a mud flood had occurred globally. And they came up with a few things that make sense only if you don't know much about them. And so we get to the second half of my notes. And the very first entry, for those who maybe bought into this, is going to feel quite vindicating, because the first thing I have written is that mud floods are real. Just not the way that the conspiracy theory suggests. See, a mud flood, also known as a mudslide or a landslide, is an actual event. It's a thing that can happen and does happen. In fact, almost every single year, multiple times a year, there are mud floods. Basically how it works is that you get a lot of rain or a lot of snow melt all at once, and it washes all of the loose dirt downhill. That's it. That's a mud flood. That's what they are. And they can be incredibly devastating. They can bury houses. They can bury people. In fact, last year, there was a huge mud flood in Alaska that knocked out power, buried multiple homes, trapped people, and it was a huge thing. I don't know if it made national news, but I pay attention to environmental news, so I read about it and was like, oh wow, that's really scary. But there are some things to know about mud floods that will help put it in a context that disproves the idea of a global mud flood to the proportions that it would erase an entire civilization from history. The first being that the antidote to mud floods is trees and grass and other plants that have nice deep roots. You won't get the level of erosion necessary for a major mud flood or landslide if you have sufficient vegetative life forms on the hillside to hold that dirt in place. So for the most part, these mud floods will occur in places where there have been major logging operations and clear cuts, in major agricultural areas, or in places where there just isn't a lot of vegetation. So places like where I live in Colorado, mud floods are more likely if there is a heavy rain than someplace like Oregon, where there's lots and lots of vegetation. The second big proof they use is architecture. They look around and they say, well, look, see how this house or building has a door that's like below ground level, or how this window touches the ground. That's proof. It used to be, the ground used to be lower, and now it flooded up to this point. And the antidote for that one is to walk around it. Because 9 times out of 10, when you have one of those buildings that they're looking at where there's a window at ground level or a recessed doorway like that, if you walk around, you'll find that is not the case for the other side of the building. Because what that building is a split level. So it isn't always feasible to simply bulldoze the land flat anytime you're going to build something. Places with a lot of hills and ravines, or just a very profound slope, like for example San Francisco, are not going to level the entirety of their land in order to build there. That would be ridiculously expensive. What they will do instead is they will dig out the specific area where the basement or the foundation for a building is going to be, and then build there, and then make like a little cutout if they have doors on that side. And a big sign that this is the case is going to be, one, if one side of the building is in fact above ground while the other side is not, but two, very often these split level buildings will have a step down from the door into the main part of the house, even if the door itself is level with the ground. So, proof 2 against it. We have proof 1, how mud floods actually work. Proof 2, split level buildings. Proof 3, I went ahead and picked Seattle. Seattle is really cool because there was a mud flood, an intentional one, and we can actually pinpoint when it happened and why. Because June 6th of 1889, Seattle caught fire, as in the entire city. It's been traced to approximately 2:20 p.m. A glue pot tipped over and caught fire, and the fire spread like wildfire. And the whole city just burned. And if you're familiar with the Seattle of today, that seems a little silly because you've got skyscrapers, and you've got cement, and you've got this and that and the other thing. But the Seattle of the 1800s, this makes perfect sense because the roads and sidewalks were made out of wood, and so were the buildings, and so was everything else. Because if there's one thing Washington has in abundance, it's trees. The other thing it has in abundance, or at least the Seattle area has in abundance, is seawater. And Seattle, up to this point, had this recurring problem where when the tide would come in, it would flood. Because the people who made it weren't really thinking the smartest about it, and also because coastlines and estuaries and rivers and deltas and basically all water forms kind of shift and change form as the water erodes certain areas and builds up certain others. So the place Seattle was originally built wasn't going to be permanent in its state that it was built in. And so when the entirety of Seattle basically burned to the ground, the people of Seattle, instead of deciding to build somewhere else, decided to build up. And so they built a series of concrete walls to guide mud from the surrounding hillsides into the city so that they could intentionally mud flood and fill in the entirety of Seattle. That's just cool as heck. I'm trying to keep it kid-friendly for this video because it's a science one, but that is just so cool to me. So they did. That's what they did. So they built all these little walls, and they got tons and tons of seawater and rainwater, and they just flooded the hillsides down and filled it in with mud. And they were like, okay, now we're going to build over it. And in addition to, historical documents telling this, and some of the surviving buildings still being there that now have a defunct bottom layer that became their basement, and then the second, third, fourth stories and so on being up, we also have vault lights and the vaults and the Seattle Underground and underground tours. And I went on another tangent with vault lights because it just was really cool to me. But when they started building upward, they decided, well, just in case we decide to use the defunct areas as storage or something, which they totally did, they would need a way to light it. And at that point in time, electrical lighting was super expensive, and gas lighting was super dangerous. I mean, they literally just had a citywide fire. They weren't going to try to do that again. So they came up with the bright idea of using glass prisms with manganese in it that would help the light to refract and spread more to channel sunlight into the underground, which is exactly what they did. What they didn't expect, though, was that the manganese in the vault lights would react with the sunlight and turn purple. So that's just a little fun fact for you. If you ever go to Seattle, you'll see that the vault lights are in fact purple because they've been there long enough for the manganese to react with the sun. Now, all of this city construction sort of finished in the very early 1900s, and that's when Seattle decided to do something really tricky. See, the women's voting movement was starting. Women didn't have the vote yet, but wanted to vote, and were starting to get more talkative about it. And one big issue that everybody knew women would be voting on was prohibition. And Seattle decided what they were going to do is pass it early. And not for the reason you'd expect. See, Seattle had a lot of cool stuff at their disposal. In fact, the Pacific Northwest in general. They had direct access to Canada, vast areas of rural land with very few cops, Boeing, and an entire underground city. And so what Seattle did is they passed prohibition early in order to drive up the price of alcohol in order to make bank on illegal booze. And if you want to learn more about that, go ahead and research it, because I could probably write an entire novel on the coolness that was Prohibition era underground speakeasies in Seattle with frickin' jet plane engines on speedboats going up to Canada to sell illegal pirate booze. Like, crazy cool stuff. Anyways, those are 3 ways to disprove mud floods with far cooler reality.